The thin red line and the New World both mark the emergence of Malick's latter-day visual style, which combines his innate sensitivity to the beauty of the natural world with compositions and movement that evoke the restlessness of his character's interior conflict. It's easy to criticize this experimental, admittedly chaotic shooting style on its face. After all, filmmaking as a commercial medium lends itself to nothing less than a disciplined, organized approach. It's not so easy to maintain that criticism when one sees the images that result, a cascading flow of imagery that contains some of the most evocative and beautiful frames ever captured to celluloid. Both the Thin Red Line and the New World are hailed for their aesthetic beauty, a product of a shared shooting style as radical as it is organic. Malick's visual aesthetic stands as a beast altogether different from mainstream cinematic conventions, but in the context of his earlier work, it's not as drastic a departure as it seems on its face. Indeed, the framework is immediately evident in Badlands and Days of Heaven's elliptical presentations, favoring evocative images exposed almost entirely by sunlight, strung together by suggestion and voiceover rather than temporal continuity. Despite their lensing by no less than 5 different cinematographers over 2 films, Malick's earliest images nonetheless distinguish themselves as part of a unified, self-realized whole. The Thin Red Line and the New World continue and expand upon Malick's established artistic conceits in every aspect, unspooling the coiled strings of experimentalism ever further in a bid to determine how much slack he really has. With The Thin Red Line, cinematographer John Toll serves a vital role in establishing the new template for Malick's pursuit of organic elegance, boxing his explorations in within the 235:1 CinemaScope frame. With their X and Y axis constrained in this way, Malick and Toll nevertheless continually propel the camera through the frame's Z axis, pushing forward and pulling back with elegant Steadicam and crane movements, while visually echoing the restless, meandering tenor of his character's voiceover. Malick found this style of working so creatively fruitful that he built on it even further for the production of The New World, again generating over 1 million feet of 35mm film as he had done on The Thin Red Line. Determined to explore the full cinematic potential of his revitalized, experimental aesthetic, Malick brought in new collaborators who believed in those possibilities as well. The New World finds Malick working for the first time with cinematographer Emanuel Chivo-Lubezki and producer Sarah Green, both of whom would go on to become vital, recurring partners in the director's subsequent work. Green's supernatural gift for anticipating Malick's unpredictable, ever-changing needs creates a production environment primed for off-the-cuff creativity, wherein Malick and Lubezki could quickly accumulate a staggering amount of achingly beautiful, Oscar-nominated footage thanks to a nimble setup that saw Chivo going handheld, or anchoring the camera to a Steadicam rig. This meant that shots could be captured and recomposed on the fly, feeding off the spontaneity of the moment at hand, instead of breaking their momentum to lay down dolly track or adjust unwieldy lights. Indeed, the overall effect is that of an eye-level account of history actively unfolding, with all the realism and visceral immediacy that implies. The New World cinematography is also notable for its use of the 65mm gauge for select shots, becoming the first feature in 9 years to shoot on the format for narrative purposes unrelated to visual effects work. This visual style lends itself well to location work, which naturally appeals to Malick's sensibilities even more by allowing him to capture the elegant chaos of the natural world. Both films were shot entirely on location, embracing the severe logistical challenges presented by the remote terrain. Malick's images benefit from the abundance of natural light and variety of color temperatures that these exteriors provide, attaining a textured, naturalistic veneer that eschews any pretense of Hollywood glamour or polish. Caring not a whit for pesky concepts like continuity or proper coverage, Malick and his team would find that their experimental shooting style afforded some rather unusual opportunities. For instance, Malick would sometimes shoot the same scene under 3 very different lighting scenarios: broad daylight, diffuse overcast light, and the golden glow of magic hour. This wasn't done because he couldn't decide on how a given scene should look, but rather because his free-flowing approach to shooting and editing allowed him to place said scene anywhere in the film without breaking the continuity of the overall narrative. It's quite difficult to imagine any other filmmaker getting away with this, but such was the wide creative berth and logistical trust accorded to Malick by his collaborators. The Thin Red Line and the New World maintained Days of Heaven's air of epic myth, using formal compositions and camera work as a means to abstractify the action, or elevate it into a higher intellectual realm. Evidenced in the recurring images of sun streaming through dense jungle foliage, a kind of elemental spirituality reigns over the Thin Red Line's visual approach. Seemingly every shot is composed so as to emphasize one of the four elements: fire, water, earth, and wind. Think to some of the film's most enduring images: the breeze whistling through tall grass, the island's indigenous population happily swimming underwater, a chaotic series of explosions back at base, and the dead Japanese soldier's face peeking up from beneath the dirt floor. The New World retains these same visual motifs, with Malick's approach becoming increasingly resonant as we witness the Jamestown settlers continually diminish Virginia's untamed wilds in their pursuit of civilization building, ultimately making for a stunning contrast in the world that Pocahontas encounters when she sails across the Atlantic, a world of dirty cobblestone streets, soaring feats of Baroque architecture, and manicured gardens and trees sheared into unnatural geometric shapes. These visual comparisons strike at the core of both films' narrative conflict, the clash between those who endeavor to live in harmony with the world that sustains them, and those who conquer and manipulate that world towards increasingly unnatural ends. On Malick's part, he and his crew endeavor to live in harmony with their environment, adopting a reactionary style of shooting calibrated to better respond to the unpredictability of their locations. Both The Thin Red Line and The New World benefit from Malick's continued partnership with production designer Jack Fisk, who finds creative solutions to the considerable logistical challenges presented by each film's respective locations. For The Thin Red Line, Malick and Fisk scouted the actual battlefields in Guadalcanal, but thanks to the difficult terrain and malaria concerns that prevented any night shooting, they ultimately decided that the Solomon Islands and Queensland, Australia, would serve as appropriate stand-ins for Guadalcanal's lush jungle vistas. Fisk's work on The New World is particularly notable, finding the celebrated art director committing himself fully to the utmost historical authenticity. He had already achieved an authentic atmosphere by finding locations that were no more than 10 miles away from the actual Jamestown settlement, but Fisk and his team went even further, rebuilding the fort with the same relatively primitive methods with which it had been constructed over 400 years ago. This being a latter-day Malick project, his team knew it was only a matter of time until he threw out the script entirely in favor of informed improvisation. While this necessitated an immersive environment where he could shoot in all directions, it also required the complete and total resurrection of the Algonquin language. Having long been considered a dead tongue, it would have been difficult enough a task to recreate only the scripted lines, but Malick's emphasis on improv meant that the entire language would need to be brought back. The painstaking process would ultimately yield valuable results far beyond the circumstances of production, subsequently becoming available for study and reinvigorated use by the present and future descendants of the Algonquin tribes. Malick's almost casual disregard for his own scripts places an inordinate amount of responsibility on the shoulders of his editors, who must make sense of the mountains of film shot with no clear idea how it would be integrated into the final product, if at all. Malick's longtime editing collaborator Billy Weber is among those who thrive under the director's guidance, having matched the influence of key technical collaborators like Lebesky and Fisk by helping to define the new visual language derived from Malick's dramatically unstructured shoots. Coming aboard 7 months into the post-production process on The Thin Red Line, Weber would oversee fellow editors Sarah Klein and Leslie Jones in building upon the editing innovations he had made with Malick on Days of Heaven. Elliptical jump cuts and lyrical vignettes became key instruments in an impressionistic orchestra of evocative images, soulful voiceover narration, and swelling score. Indeed, the voiceovers assume the role of narrator in the absence of conventionally covered sequences, with lines like,
"This great evil, what seed, what root did it grow from?"
speaking to the characters grappling with their innate capacity for cruelty towards others, having become rotten on the inside, souls poisoned by the act of war. While Weber only served as an associate producer on The New World, he no doubt wielded sizable influence over the post-production team of Sarah Klein, Hank Corbin, Richard Chu, and Mark Yoshikawa, helping them unlearn what they had learned on other more conventional jobs by demonstrating the potency of Malick's voiceover template.
"You are a mother."
It's here that we encounter the first of Malick's recurring references to a single cosmic soul as Mother, finding Pocahontas using the term in hushed, prayer-like voiceovers to invoke the creation that surrounds her. Her ephemeral, abstract monologues contrast with Captain Smith's matter-of-fact narration, which itself was derived from Smith's many writings about his travels. Both monologues profess a profound awe towards this untouched paradise, a desire to become one with it rather than tame it. This is the root of their connection, which renders their surface differences as minor obstacles easily overcome by simply listening to each other. Malick weaves these interior sentiments together into a coursing river of thought and speech, sometimes even overlapping the voiceover with the diegetic dialogue to create an immersive audio mosaic that's not supposed to be necessarily listened to, but rather absorbed on a penetrating subconscious level. To take a job, any job, on a Malick production is to subsume one's own ego or die trying. Christopher Plummer publicly expressed his desire to never work with Malick again after learning that his performance in The New World had been chopped to bits in the final edit. Malick is unafraid of bruising the egos of his collaborators in pursuit of his vision, and those who excel in the face of challenge are the ones who keep coming back to the director's fold time and time again. In this regard, the composers on Malick's films don't tend to do as well. The mileage one gets from the experience depends on one's individual ego, and on The Thin Red Line and The New World, famed composers Hans Zimmer and James Horner had decidedly different outlooks on their time with Malick. Zimmer reportedly composed over 4 hours of music for The Thin Red Line, but much like Malick's seemingly merciless excision of his actors in the edit, little of the maestro's score was actually used. Even then, certain cues like Journey to the Line have managed to penetrate pop culture to a degree that film scores usually do not, becoming something of a go-to piece for other filmmakers' temp tracks. Zimmer's stately orchestra reinforces the sweeping scope of Malick's vision with a propulsive majesty, underscored by subtle winds that evoke Malick's elemental visual motifs and a ticking clock that anticipates the character of Zimmer's future scores for fellow director Christopher Nolan. Horner would not share Zimmer's positive outlook, with Malick's impulsive creative process earning the late composer's bitter enmity. "I've never felt more let down by a filmmaker in my life," Horner exclaimed in an interview shortly afterwards, expressing his sincere frustration with the manner in which his score was used. Or not used, as is the case with the bulk of The New World's musical landscape. Horner's score here is very characteristic of his unique sound, a stately blend of regal horns and majestic orchestration that immediately invites comparisons to his landmark scores for Mel Gibson's Braveheart and James Cameron's Titanic. Indeed, Horner's approach underscores his initial impression that The New World would replicate the alchemy of sweeping romance and epic historical drama that made Titanic such a cultural phenomenon. He even wrote an original song sung by Haley Westenra called Listen to the Wind, in a somewhat transparent bid to succeed Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. Malick, however, had no interest in making the next Titanic, and thus retains only the most relevant and resonant qualities of Horner's score. As he had done on films prior, Malick supplements his composer's contributions by pulling from his extensive library of classical cues. In addition to the recurring use of a religious hymn sung by a Melanesian choir, The Thin Red Line sources tracks from renowned classical artists like John Powell and Gabriel Fauré, making particularly pointed use of Charles Ives' The Unanswered Question, as a musical echo of his character's internal soul-searching. The New World creates an aura of mythic timelessness and a rapturous sense of destiny, with well-chosen cues like Wagner's Vorspiel to Das Rheingold and Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23. In choosing such operatic cues, Malick certainly runs the risk of inflating The New World with the air of pompous self-importance. But his unconventional approach to montage, as well as his focus on the purity of the image, delicately balances his musical palette's operatic energy, all while further reinforcing the film's contrasting of Virginia's untamed wilds with the supposed civility of 17th century English society.